Working with Illustrator can be a little bit intimidating at first. While it's not like 100% intuitive. A lot of times, at least in my experience, playing with these programs, when I first started playing with the programs, I found Photoshop to be like relatively intuitive. I feel, not that it's easy per se, but I feel like it's the easiest program or one of the few Adobe programs that you can just open up and start playing around in, because you can open up a photo and you can start messing around with the photo, this and that, blah, blah, blah. Illustrator is not necessarily so. So like when you open Illustrator for the first time, you get this, I have my Essentials Classic interface open. When you open a new file, hopefully, there we go. Again, I just did the shortcut. I did Command. If you're used to working on a PC, going back and forth from PCs to Macs are kind of a pain, because all of your hotkeys, all of your shortcuts are Command, which is next to the space bar. They're all of the basic commands like new, save, close, cut, copy, paste. I'm trying to think of all the basics. Undo, which is a big one, are all the same pretty much across every application. Microsoft Word to Illustrator, like all those basic functions are going to be those commands. But you got to get used to. I've gone back and forth in various jobs of like having a Mac at home and having a PC at work and vice versa, and I always forget, because with PCs it's Control and whatever the shortcut is, and then so it's really like using your pinky and doing the shortcuts, or using your thumb and doing. And I always don't do it right first whenever. So now I'm so used to working on Macs again that like whenever I go to a PC, I go to do Command New and it's not working, and I get frustrated, and I was like, oh, yeah, it's Control, not Command. Anyway, so you can either do, I just did the Command N for New, or you can go under File, New, and we open up. We get this new layout, which I honestly don't like. I usually default back to the classic open document thing, but if you guys are used to this, that's fine. Because we have some information that the book does reference when we start working with artboards. Like we open up a multiple artboard document, you're going to want to hit more settings, and that opens up. This is the classic new dialog, and I'll show you preferences too, but I always change that in preferences to show this way because I just like the information here. So you have more information, not just, so we have here, you have your basic information for your artboard size, the orientation, portrait or landscape, how many artboards you want. Here we have a little bit more settings. We have the number of artboards, how you want them arranged, because you can have them grid by row, grid by column. So if you have like 10, or just arranged by row, arranged by column, like arranged by row, if you had 10, they're just going to be 10 in a straight line, or 10 in a straight column, or they're going to go from left to right, top, so it'll be 1, and then 2 on the right, and then 3 underneath 1. Does that make sense? Or have it flow this way, where it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Anyway, we have a couple of other features here, which we'll get into. Again, orientation, you can see a lot of it is mirrored here. The bleed, which we'll get into, that's a printing thing. It's basically extra space for a printer to use when they're cutting down a physical piece. The color modes, generally we're going to be working in CMYK. Again, later in the semester we'll get into working with CMYK and RGB formats. Generally for print, 9 times out of 10 for print you're working in CMYK. There's the rare occasion where you need to work RGB, but very rare in print. Basically anything for screen, usually I say web, but there's a lot more screen technology, obviously. Anything for screen is RGB. Those are just the different color mixes. So CMYK is a printing, if you guys are familiar, is a printing output. It uses a 4-color process: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, K for black. And then RGB uses the red, green, and blue to do the mixes of colors. And they just represent differently. As you, again, as we go further into the semester, when you go back and forth even in the same document, changing it from RGB to CMYK and vice versa, you'll see the color shift slightly. Just different applications. You have your raster effects, pixels per inch resolution, which we don't have to really worry about. We're just going to leave that as a default. But anyway, I'm more used to this interface. So when you open up, I'm going to go back to one artboard. And here you can have size. It said custom because I had 5x5 was the last one I opened. You have your presets here. Letter. A4 is essentially letter. It's a little bit bigger than letter. It's a Euro style. Legal, tabloid, etc., etc. So when you go to letter, you'll see you have your 8.5 by 11, portrait or landscape, all your fun. So I'm just going to hit create document, and then you'll see this is a long way to go. So you see when you open up Illustrator, it's not as intuitive, I guess, as when you open up a photo in Photoshop to start playing around with. It's kind of, I guess, harder to play around in Illustrator than it is in Photoshop. So we have our blank document. In general, our workspace, the workspace includes the entire document, I guess. So this is our artboard. This is where everything is going to be live, and then you have your pasteboard or your workspace, which is like overflow. I'll bring in some documents and show you, like my pasteboards are a mess. Because generally I do like my sketching, whatever you want to call it, on the sides usually, and I have copies of stuff that I played around with. And then I have my artboard where I have essentially my final stuff. And then when I export, you can check or uncheck use artboard, and basically it cuts anything off that's in the excess, so my clients never see the mess that's my workspace. So that's often referred to as a workspace or the pasteboard. We have our menu bar here, control panels, and our tools panel. You'll see we have the tools panel defaults to the left here, and we have a variety of basic tools. We're going to cover most of them throughout the semester. So we have your select tool. I'm trying to hover over it so that it actually does. Generally, if you hover over, no, it should give you a little, like, those little pop-up hints, so if you're unsure. So you have your select tool, your direct selection, which we'll use a bunch, a couple of, a wand tool, which we generally, oh, nope, I thought I was going to do it. There we go, magic wand tool, which honestly I rarely, if ever, use in Illustrator. The lasso tool, which again I rarely ever use in Illustrator. Your pen tool, and any tool that has, I know it's really hard to see, but as you use it on your own machine, the pen tool, any tool that has that little tiny triangle in the bottom right means that there's more options. So if you hold down as you're clicking, you see you get, under your pen tool, you can add anchor points. You get your add anchor point tool, your delete anchor point tool, your anchor point conversion tool, which we get into in the next couple assignments. We have our, why isn't it popping up? It's not popping up. Anyway, modify pen tool. We have our text tool, our line tool, which technically the line tool and the pen tool are technically different. Obviously the line tool will draw lines. The pen tool will add paths or lines in between points, so you're actually making anchor points, and it'll put paths. Everything in Illustrator is made up of paths and anchors. So an anchor is a point, and then the path is the connection between the 2 points. We have our shapes tools here, which we'll use a ton. So you have your basic shapes, rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon tool, your star tool, and your flare tool. All of these have different options, which we'll go through, I keep saying, at a later date. And then as we go down, brush, various brush tools. We're going to use these, or this particular tool, the rotate and reflect for our assignment coming up. Scale, which I use constantly. You have your scale tool, your shear tool, which is a way to, you'll see the kind of preview. It's a way to sort of shear to explain it. This is not correct, but it's kind of like how italics, like text italics, are kind of on an angle. They're sheared, but you can shear any shape or any object on the artboard. And then the reshape tool, and then a variety of other advanced tools that we'll get into later. The eyedropper tool actually is something that I use constantly, and I'll show you that again a little bit later. Magnifying glass tool, I tend not to use this a lot. This is going to get into going through our view. Oops. Through our view. So we have, again, our control panel. You'll see as you go through, I was hoping, there we go. For a lot of these, if you look at the top here, you'll see as you go through, when you switch, the select tools aren't going to do it. There we go. And a lot of it has to have something on the actual artboard and selected. But you'll see, like, when you go through different tools, you have your control bar. So you have, like when you're on your text tool, we have the character, like any word processing program. You have your characters, any kind of modifiers, condensed, italics, etc. The point, your paragraph, justification, align left, align center, align right. In Illustrator, there's always like at least 3 or more ways to do the same thing. So you'll see here you have your basic commands. So I just clicked once to get this. This used to drive me crazy when they first started doing this, but now I actually find it really handy. They basically just place dummy text when you click. So, for example, then I'm going to go back to my select tool. And now you'll see we get a couple different options. So as we clicked our select tool, this X and Y shows the placement on the artboard. So as we move on the artboard, these numbers change. This can come in handy. I find it comes in handy more with more things that you need to, like planning documents, things like that, which you need to be like super accurate with. What you can do is basically it starts as your X and Y is like 0 here. So if you wanted to have this be your reference point is where it's going to move it from. And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but like if you want to have your reference point be the top left corner, so it's going to be here. We want to have like 0 and 0. It's going to align to that top left corner. So if you want to have something, 2 inches over and 5 inches down, it'll place it like exactly and it'll align it to that left corner. I tend to only use this, to be honest, I use it here and there. I tend to only use it if I am, I'm trying to think of the last document I actually used it on. I think it was like a floor plan for somebody. So we had like a specific set, not that this isn't, if you're working in a document that's 8 by 10 or 8.5 by 11, but this was like a floor plan where it was like, whatever, the room was 20 by 20, so I wanted to make sure that we had it gridded out by feet and all that fun stuff. So this will allow you to move, instead of just kind of arbitrarily. But it'll also show you as you move through, it'll show you how much you're moving from your last point. Those numbers help as well. And then this is the actual width and height of your, I'm going to undo a bunch, the actual width and height of your object that you have. Right now it's set to not constrained proportions. You can see that little link thing with the slash through it. So I'm going to click it to make sure that it does constrain. So now you'll see both numbers change as you change the one number. That's a way to scale. If you want this, again, to be 4 inches wide, and I'm just hitting tab to go to the next, it automatically sets this to just about an inch high. But you'll see my whole point was, for going through, since it's text, you have some of this text, like you have, your character and your paragraph, but you also have, since it's also an object, you have some of these tools change a little bit. And then as you go through your direct selection tool, I'm trying to see if there's other tools that allow me to, anyway, as we're working, you'll see, there we go. So we go to our rotate tool. Those kind of go away. You'll see this control will change as you're working. We'll show, just draw a box here. Now that we've drawn a box, our shape tool will give you options for drawing specific shapes. If we go through the selection tool and the direct selection tool, it changes a little bit because there's a little bit more options with the direct selection tool because you can modify individual points. Anyway, as we go through working, you'll see the control changes. The control changes based on what type of object you have selected. If you select more than one object, there's a couple different ways to do it. You can hold down Shift and select multiple objects, and then you'll see our control panel changed. Now that it knows we have 2 different objects selected, it'll give you your align options, so you can align all these fun different ways to align stuff. I'm going to undo a bunch. I'm kind of like jumping all over the place here, and I'm sorry. You can customize your workspace. I'm trying not to get ahead of myself. You can customize your workspace. Like I said, right now we're in Essentials Classic. And basically what this does is it brings up, so you have your tools here, and then you have your various palettes here depending on what you're working with. So you have your color. Why is my mouse freaking out? Awesome, those are supposed to be opening. So you have Essentials, which will bring up what they have determined are the essentials for working in Illustrator. To be honest, the new Essentials I absolutely hate, which is why I go back to Essentials Classic, and hopefully that'll actually open. I don't know why that's happening. These are supposed to be opening. Let's see. There we go. Well, then we're going to have, so basically when we went to Essentials Classic and it was this like compact, I have everything compact on my workspace just because I like it that way. I don't know why it's not. It's supposed to be opening up just the single palette when you click on, I need to restart, but I'm not going to do it right now. Supposed to be opening up this palette when you click on that little compact workspace. I like to have as much desktop space as possible, so that's why I have my workspace completely compact. But you'll see here as you click on your, we opened up that the character palette, you'll see you have, again here, since we click on my name here, you have your control at the top. You also have the same features here, but you have a lot more features within the palettes. So you have, which we get into next week, you have character options like kerning and tracking, and some leading options, different types of options. You can do small caps, all caps, superscript, subscript, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a lot more options, to work with. I'm going to uncheck that. There we go. Than just the control. You can also temporarily open, if you click that character, you can temporarily open all these options or most of these options. But once you click off, it goes away, obviously. I honestly go back and forth. Sometimes if I'm doing something really fast, I'll open this character thing really fast. If I'm doing something that's a little bit more work intensive, I'll keep it open here. But again, in Illustrator, there's like at least 3 or 4 places you can do the same thing. You have color options as we open up. I hate opening up like this, but you have swatches here, which load your default swatches to change colors if you would like. You also have your color palette, which automatically changes to an eyedropper, and you can kind of change colors this way if you want sort of an more arbitrary number. And then it also comes with color guides, which is something we will get into way later in the semester. I generally tend to use swatches, and occasionally I'll open up a color book because for color matching, which we'll talk about, for color matching, I'll open up like the Pantone set, so you can get really specific colors. But here's where you're going to create any new swatches or import swatches or open swatch libraries, et cetera. So basically, this is all different types of palettes that will work with the tools on the left side that you're working with. And they have, again, this one was for layout. They have them basically set up for working with web with different options, any kind of like coding, CSS properties, typography. Well, very little will change here, but it'll open up all of your typography options, more typography options like character styles, paragraph styles, open type, paragraph, etc. The first time you open this too, it'll give you a whole bunch of hints that you can either look at or dismiss. Printing and proofing, all this fun stuff. I'm going to go back to Essentials Classic and hopefully, there we go. I'm just going to leave that open. So you have your color guides here, swatches, brushes, symbols. Again, we'll work with all this stuff later in the semester. You can also customize this, like on my personal machine. I have a custom set of tools of all the things that I use. I use my Pathfinder, which we'll use a lot. So I have my Pathfinder as one of my default things here. You know, I have my, just because I've always worked that way, I have my layers and artboards on this side underneath my tools palette and whatever. So you can arrange all the windows however you'd like. And then under the workspace, you can do new workspace. Nope. It's opening on my other monitor. And you can call it whatever you want, like Andy, whatever. I have like default Andy, and I think I have like color Andy for color correction, whatever. And then I'm not going to do it, but you can hit OK. Oh, whatever. Sample, I hit OK. And then now you'll see that will come up in the list here as something to default to go back to. Because what ends up happening, and I'm sure you all do it, I do it all the time, is I'll go to my brushes or something, or go to my swatches, and I'll accidentally drag it out, and now my palette is sort of floating on its own. And sometimes instead of trying to get it to go back exactly where it was and move it exactly where it was, I'll just go to reset, and then it resets everything. Like I'll show you, if you just, instead of trying to get it to go back, you can hit reset, and then it'll put everything back to where it was, and all that fun stuff. I already went over the triangles, the submenus from our tools that we have. Let's see, you can also, I never have good luck with it, but you can also, there we go. You have this little, these are all really tiny, but you have this little indicator here, and you can kind of, I never get it to work right. There we go. If you click on that little menu thing on the side, you can get this floating menu, which will give you all the options instead of holding down and selecting. If you don't feel like doing that, you can click that little, again, well, I'm trying to hold down, there we go. You can click that little extra triangle there, and that'll bring up this floating menu if you want to have something temporarily. I'll do it here and there for tools and have it temporarily out, and then I'll go back to my, either close this or go back to my reset workspace. And that allows you to be able to expand and keep your tools palette open, the extra options open if you want to keep them open. Tool tips I just talked about. Sorry. Docking panels together, again, is when you can rearrange. So if you wanted, more color information, if you wanted your stroke to be with your, you want brushes and symbols together, you're docking these two together. And then what you can also do, Like again, this goes into making custom workspaces. Let's say you don't want these two, and you want your swatches and stroke, and then you want your symbols and brushes to be a separate part of these panels. You can have it, you can dock it with one of the panels, and you can kind of see as I hover over that blue outline that pops up, we'll add it to this group or add it to this group, or see how that blue line pops up in between them? It sort of adds it to a new grouping. So it's a way to dock and arrange your panels, and now you see, I don't know why that's not working. You'll see now you have these different little groups separated by those menu indicators. So moving and modifying and viewing the artboard, like almost any other application, you have your magnification. You can hit under view. You have zoom in, zoom out, fit artboard in window, fit all in window. If you had like 10 artboards, you can do fit all in window, and it'll bring all the artboards into your window. I tend to use the shortcuts for these constantly. Zoom in and zoom out, just because I find it too much of a pain to keep hitting zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. I'll generally do either a command plus or a command minus, and that allows you to zoom in. A handy thing that I admittedly learned, I should have known this a long time ago, anywhere, doesn't matter what tool you're on, anywhere within Illustrator, if you hold down the space bar just by itself, you get this little hand, it's underneath, there you go. You get that hand tool, which allows you to move things. So if you zoomed in a bunch and you know you wanted to go back up to your name, you can just hit the space bar, and it allows you to pull and drag your document. Let's say we zoom in a bit and we want to get back to that A. We can hit space bar and drag around. I learned that way later than I should have, and it like changed my Illustrator life. So anyway, so zooming, you can zoom in, zoom out. What I use a lot, again, is those shortcuts, either zoom in, zoom out, and then I'll use Command 0 or fit artboard in window. That's a big one that I go back to just get the artboard back, to get everything back in view. Again, just from going through, moving around, getting into details and whatever, and then just going back to sort of a reset for myself. Is doing that Command 0 allows you to go back into having your entire artboard in your view. Modifying elements, I sort of went through it really quickly, but modifying elements, changing colors, sizes, etc. Again, there's at least 3 spots to do this. So changing colors, for example, you'll see in our control, we have our basic functions. In our control menu, we have here, it's telling you what we have selected. So it'll give you an indicator of what we have selected. So it's type here, and then here we have a rectangle. So it's showing you the fill and the stroke size, the type, etc., etc. There's no stroke. That's why we're getting that slash to show us that there's no stroke. You'll see here you have a similar thing. This is showing us our fill. It's basically showing us the same information in a different spot. Once you start getting into your own workflow, working with Illustrator, like I said, the last class I've been doing this for, I think since like Illustrator 3 maybe, which is like easily almost 20 years ago. Like I have my own quirks in my own way. I generally tend not to use this too much. That's just my thing. I'll either use my color swatches here, or I'll just change it up here. But again, this is just showing you some of the information. So showing us that we have a black fill. Again, here a black fill with no stroke, and then it's also showing it here, black fill with no stroke. The one thing that is handy about this part of the palette is you have this little curved arrow here that allows you to swap that really quickly. I do use that occasionally. So if you wanted, no fill with a black stroke, because sometimes it defaults to whatever the last thing was or whatever the default thing is when you first open it. It allows you to swap that color. What ends up happening a lot too is if you're in, and open up our color palette, if you're in, if you've been playing around with color and going back and forth in swatches or strokes to fills, a lot of times you'll have this open or this on top, the stroke on top, which changes the stroke. You can barely see there. I'll zoom in a little bit. And I do this a lot where I have my stroke active and I mean to have my fill active. And I accidentally, so you just want that fill to sort of be on top, see where they overlap, and then you can change your, so what I end up doing a lot is I'll have my stroke active and I'll change it to red and I'm like, oh crap, I just put a red stroke on it. So sometimes I'll just kind of swap it really quick and then I'll take off the fill. Or, you know, you can go here, take off the fill, and then go back to your fill here and go active. Again, another place to do it is once you click on this, you get your same palette. You can see it's the same thing. Click on no stroke there, and then click on the red. Again, there's always at least 3 or 4 ways to do the same thing in Illustrator. And again, as you start working and getting more comfortable with the program, you'll sort of get into your own workflow. Let's see. If rulers aren't shown, sort of by default, you see here the rulers aren't shown. Anything that's viewable, and there's a ton. This is one of the ones where, there they are. It takes me a little while. A lot of times with drop downs, it takes me a little while to find it because I'm so used to the shortcuts. We can see here, show rulers, and then our rulers pop up here. Generally by default, whenever I open a new document, I automatically show rulers. So you can do view, again, view. Now they're shown, so it'll be hide, or Command R for rulers. So as we do Command R, you'll see them turn on and off. It's just kind of, again, one of my little quirks. I automatically show rulers first. Let's see. Measurements and aligning, I talked about it a little bit. We'll talk about preferences. I don't know how much we're going to get into or how much these lab machines allow you to get into the preferences, but if you're working on your own machines, like any application on the Mac platform, you have your preferences panel, and as you click general, you get all of your options. So you have, I'm trying to think of some of a lot of these I generally never change. Use legacy file new interface. That's the one that I do click and I use. I showed you that in the very beginning. Double click to isolate. Generally, I turn that off because I find that to be a pain. Something I personally don't. Some people find that handy when you have a pretty complex illustration and you want to just modify one piece of the illustration. If you double click it, it'll go into isolation mode. So it kind of like washes out. I'll show you, but it sort of washes out all of the other objects, and I do it by accident all the time, and it drives me crazy. So I just turn that off. But it does come in handy. Like I said, I can show you. It does come in handy if you're working with a fairly complex illustration. You have display options for how your anchors can look, your points, points and handles, type options, units, which is going to be your rulers. You can set up. You have a whole bunch of different points, picas, millimeters, centimeters, pixels. Some of them make sense. Some of them might not. Points and picas are printing references. Inches, we all know what inches are. Millimeters, all that fun stuff. Pixels. If you're working in web, you can set up a document. If you know you're doing something for a web ad, let's say, and you know it's arbitrarily whatever, like 1920 pixels by 100 pixels high, you can set up that document to the exact size you need and then export. So you have a JPEG or whatever at that those pixel dimensions. Guides and grids, you can change the color of your guides if you wish. Your grid, which we'll get into later, you can change some of the options. You can have your grid, your guides either be dots or lines. Generally, I don't know anybody that works with them as dots. Smart guides, you can turn them on or off. I personally like smart guides. I find them very helpful. I have a friend that's been working in Illustrator longer than me, and he absolutely hates smart guides. He finds them super, super distracting, so he turns them off. But here's where it'll give you, transforming tools, object highlighting, and I'll go over this physically, alignment guides, et cetera, et cetera. He unchecks all this stuff. Slices is for web-based stuff. Anyway, and then it gets into more and more complex things. But generally, we have our general preferences here. Our type and our units and our guides is what usually people kind of mess around with. I'm going to cancel out of that. So let's show. I'm going to open up, hide Illustrator very quickly. Let's see. I'll open this document. And then I will open this document to show us smart guides. So when I was talking about isolation mode, so this is a fairly complex illustration, right? Probably should have said this in the beginning, but so Illustrator is a vector-based program versus Photoshop, which is a raster-based program. The main difference is a raster-based program uses pixels. So they're making basically little dots to make your image. So the more dots, the more clear your image is, right? So the whole resolution, pixels per inch, DPI and PPI, dots per inch and pixels per inch are technically different. People often swap the terms. They get into that more in the Photoshop class. But basically, the more dots you have, the more detailed the image is, right? The drawback is the more dots you have, the more information you have. So you end up with larger file sizes. So if you had, for example, a 5-inch by 5-inch solid black image, right? You have a 5-inch by 5-inch solid black image in Photoshop. That black image is made up of a whole bunch of dots next to each other that make a solid black thing, right? In Illustrator, since it's a vector-based program, what it does is it's basically all math and code. It will fill, even if it's solid black, it essentially does code to where it fills between vectors, which are essentially the points. All the vectors are wherever you are on the artboard is a vector. So what it'll do is it'll fill a space. So let's say, for argument's sake, that. And so this was the last. So this is one of the few times I'll use this. I'm just going to turn that off. So what it's doing, what Illustrator is going to do, instead of filling this with pixels, it's going to fill from this vector to this vector to this vector to this vector. It's just going to fill that mathematically or with code, essentially. It's going to fill that with whatever, it's going to know it's black because you have it set as black. So it's using vectors rather than pixels. So what ends up happening is you get way smaller file sizes. And then you also don't have to deal with resolution issues. So if you were to print, if you were to have this black object that's about, let's for argument's sake make it 2 by 2, right? If you were to make this 200 by 200, it's still going to be nice solid black, right? If you have, if you start off with a 2 by 2 image at 300 DPI in Photoshop, and then you make that 20 inches by 20 inches, you'll start to see some resolution breakdown. You see that a lot more with photos rather than solid color. It's a bad example. But you don't have resizing issues. You don't have resolution issues. If you have a logo, for example, if you have a logo that's done in a vector-based program, you can size that to 400 feet by 400 feet. And if it's vector-based, it's not going to break down at all. If you've designed it in Photoshop and you have a raster-based logo and you need to print that bigger than the original size, you're going to run into resolution problems, right? If you design something 5 inches by 5 inches at 300 DPI and you're going to print it 10 inches by 10 inches, you've essentially cut your resolution in half. So it's not going to be as crisp an image, right? This will hopefully all make a little bit more sense when we get into when we get further in the semester. But those are the basics between a vector-based program and a raster-based program. Illustrator is a vector-based program. So you can also, that doesn't mean you can't create complex illustrations or detailed illustrations or photorealistic illustrations. Obviously, there's reasons why you would use one application over another. But let's say this illustration, obviously it looks a little bit, we know it's not hand-drawn, but it looks a little bit more drawn rather than a photo of a motorcycle, right? But it's still fairly detailed. We can get a little bit more detailed than that by adding shapes and adding colors. But this is all made up. As we select it, you can see each one of these is essentially a separate piece or a separate vector, right? If you think about it like construction paper, kind of like you're making, you're building something out of different colored pieces of paper. That's kind of how a vector program works. This is all grouped, and I can show you also the difference between our select tool and our direct select tool. So this is a group set of objects, right? So if we're using our select tool, we're selecting it and we're moving the whole thing. It selects it as a group. If you wanted to modify, let's say, this green shape here by itself, there's a couple different options. You can ungroup all of it and then go back in with the selection tool. But that can be a pain because if you forget to group all of it, or if you go to select everything and you miss one and you leave it behind, then you can run into leaving some details. Like let's say we ungroup it and then we modify this and then we group it and we forget like this little piece or something like that, then it's, you copy and paste it and you've lost a piece of the element. So this is where our direct selection tool comes in handy. What it allows you to do is, you can see as we hover over, it's kind of hard to see with some of them, but you get that blue outline. So let's say we wanted to make this a little bit bigger, and I'll zoom in, and you can see now we have the points that make up that shape. And if you wanted to modify it, move it, etc. This is actually behind, which isn't helpful at all, but you can modify this object. There we go. I'm going to move it in front. So all I did there, that's when I did a shortcut. I just did an object arrange, and we'll play with this again. I just brought it to the front just so that it was on top. So now we can modify that shape as we want. A trick that I do, let me go back so it's the original. There we go. Go back to the original shape. I'm going to transform, arrange, bring to front so it's on top. What I'll do sometimes is I'll direct select and make sure that I'll click essentially in the middle of the object so I have all of the 3 points selected. And then I'll go back to my selection tool, and now it'll allow me to resize this object and constrain the proportions. I'm holding shift. That's another super common command. Holding shift allows me to change the object and constrain those proportions. If I let go of shift, you'll see I kind of stretch it. If you want to grow, this is another one I use a lot. If you hold option while holding shift, it grows from the center. So it allows you to, say we just wanted that to be just a little bit bigger. So now we have that object just a touch bigger. And using the combination of the direct selection tool with the selection tool, we didn't have to worry about ungrouping these objects, ungrouping the objects and then grouping them back up. Again, as we get further into the semester, it makes a little bit more sense. That isolation mode thing that I was talking about, I don't know if it's going to let us. Yeah, it's a grouped object, so let's see. I'm honestly not sure. Nope. It has to be ungrouped to be in isolation mode. So let's ungroup. So I'm going to go Object, and here I'm going to do ungroup or Shift Command G for ungroup. So now, if everything, yeah, see, this is also the problem. With somebody else's illustration, you don't know how grouped it is. So I'm going to hold down Command Shift, and I'm just going to hit G a bunch of times, and hopefully that ungrouped everything. There we go. That's what's problematic about working with someone else's illustrations, is you also don't know how they have them grouped. 9 times out of 10 with my old job is what I did was fix other people's artwork. So the isolation mode thing, again, like let's say you just wanted to work on this piece by itself without accidentally selecting. So now we can't select any of this by accident. I'm dragging to select and it won't let me. This is one that I do all the time by accident. I'm going to hit escape to get out of it, but I'll go to click something and I'll just accidentally double click, and then you see how it grays out, sort of washes out all the other objects. So it shows you that you're in isolation mode, the layer and the path that you're on, but it kind of allows you to, you know, if you wanted again to make that a little bit bigger and not have to worry about accidentally selecting this green piece or something like that. You know, you want to rotate this, and then you're done with isolation mode. I just hit escape to get out of it, and then now you can get back to your illustration. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to focus on like one piece of a complex illustration without accidentally selecting other pieces. And as a personal preference, to me, to be honest, it drives me crazy because I do it by accident all the time. So in my preferences, I shut it off. That's where, going back to my other friend, he uses it all the time and he actually really likes it. I have a tendency to just, I work very fast, not in that way, but I have like my mouse speed, like when you scroll across the screen, I have it set to like the super fastest, whatever, and I have my double clicking set to be like super sensitive, so just kind of how I like my setup. So what that does is it also makes it very easy to double click and get into isolation mode very easily when you don't want to. Yeah, I showed you that. Screen modes, generally we're going to be working in preview mode. I shouldn't say rarely, but for this class, very rarely, we're going to work in outline mode. Outline mode helps a lot when you have a super complex illustration. It shows you the outlines of every part of the illustration. So I'm trying to see, maybe I'm hoping right here. So let's go back to preview. Preview mode. No, it's not. A lot of times when I'll get artwork from somebody that I did not create, the first thing that I'll do, especially with like logos or something, first thing that I'll do is do outline mode, because you might have an object behind another object. And whether or not, like, let's say for example, you know, you have this, for argument's sake, let's say this is a logo. This is where, I know I'm kind of jumping around, this is where this eyedropper comes in handy. I use this all the time. I'll just throw this in there. If you want something to match a fill, you can hit that eyedropper and it'll basically copy any attribute that is on the object. I'm just going to cut and paste behind. So let's say for argument's sake, this square is a logo, right? The one reason I will go into outline mode, especially with logos, is just to see if there's an object buried behind another object, so that I know I can either get rid of it, or see if it needs to be in front or something like that. Where this comes in handy, and I'm hoping to do this again, is with taking a little field trip, is with sign work, sign shops. I know I mentioned that, with a plotter versus a printer. It's basically, a plotter is basically a printer, and instead of a print head, it's got a knife and it'll cut, but it will cut anywhere there is a path. So if you had, let's go back to preview. So if you had this, again for argument's sake we'll say it's a logo, and you had something behind it but you didn't see it and you didn't double check it, it will cut that circle as well. So it'll cut this arbitrary circle in the middle of your logo, and you don't want that. Even, let's say, so as you hover over, some of the smart outlines and things like that in Illustrator help a lot. Like, you see how we have this object, we have this green And again, I don't know why they built this illustration the way they did, but we have this green on top of green. So like if we don't select it, it just looks like a solid green piece, right? But as we hover over, we can see that it's a separate piece. Or if we do outline mode, you can see that there's a separate piece of green there. I generally don't work in outline mode. I'm not sure I know anybody that does, but it's a good for sort of double checking, or if you have a complex illustration, it's nice to be able to check work and see if you have any extra weird stuff going on. 9 times out of 10, you're going to be working in preview mode. Already did that. Sorry, I'm just going through my notes. All right, we will get into, smart guides. I wanted to go through that, and then I will get into demoing a little bit of the first assignment, working with artboards. So let me show you working with objects and smart guides. So you have different objects on this artboard, right? The smart guides allow you to see those goofy pink lines and text that pops up. This is why it drives my friend crazy, because he just, I don't know, he finds it really super distracting. What this allows you to do, it allows you to sort of be able to eyeball, and instead of just eyeballing, it'll actually sort of snap to a point to where you can align an object. So now these two objects, using your smart guides, will allow you to line these vertically at their centers, right? You can also, if you go up a touch, or I'll move it down, you can align it at the center, or you can align the tops, you can align the bottom, etc., etc. Instead of, if you select, you can either shift, again I did that earlier, shift select, or what I tend to do a lot is I'll drag and select. I'll just start in an empty space and just drag over 2 objects that I want to select. You have your align options here, so if you didn't want to drag select or shift select and then go to your align options, you can use those smart guides to, let's say I want this star to align with the left of that pink. Is it not going to work? There it goes. You want that to align with the left of the pink square there. You can use the smart guides to do so. It'll also allow you, when you have multiple shapes, this is something that we'll go into, I use a ton. When you have an object selected and you want to copy that object, you can either do a copy and paste, or what I do a lot of times is if you hold down Option when you are hovering over the object, you see that little white arrow pop up behind it. That allows you to drag and copy. I use that a lot. It's super handy. So if you hold Shift, like with almost any other program, as I'm holding Option and Shift, so I'm copying. But when I'm holding Shift, it allows me, like, see how I'm kind of floating a little bit with my mouse, I guess. Holding Shift sort of forces it to align, so you're not moving it off center. Like if I'm not holding Shift, it's easy for me to kind of move it off center. With the smart guides, you can kind of keep it aligned a little easier, but holding Shift sort of forces it, like it doesn't really, there you go, it doesn't really move, it sort of snaps to a grid. It doesn't really move out of alignment until you really, really force it. But let's say we have, I'm just going to do a third object, so hopefully this pops up. There we go. I find this super handy with our smart guides. There, it's showing you that your spaces between the objects are exactly the same, which is kind of nice. So you can use smart guides for a variety of different things. As you hover over as well, especially getting used to working with Illustrator, and as we get used to working with objects, you can see as you start to hover over, I'll use a direct selection tool so it's a little bit less cluttered. You can see it'll tell you where your anchor is, so you know you're selecting an anchor point if you wanted to just use this anchor to modify the shape, or if you wanted to grab the path, which moves both anchor points. It shows you the center of the object, path, anchor. It'll also highlight just about any other useful information But again, I keep them on because I like to, especially with more complex illustrations, I like to know, especially so if I don't want to zoom in a ton, like here, knowing you want to select that anchor, the anchor shows up so you know you're selecting that anchor instead of the path by accident. I tend to really like smart guides. When you're using the direct selection versus the selection tool, you'll see here with more complex shapes, not that a circle is very complex, but with a circle versus a star versus a rectangle, you have a bounding box on every object, and then you have your actual shape. So your bounding box and the fill is exactly the same on a rectangle or a square, but you have with a circle and with a star, your bounding box is very different. So you still have your fill, technically it's an ellipse, but for your circle or ellipse, but then your bounding box will show you the area to the outermost points, right? So your bounding box will still technically be a square, even with a star. Even though this is rotated, you'll see that's fairly straight. Your bounding box will still be relatively square. Doesn't mean that that's your shape. It's just your bounding box versus the actual shape, right? These goofy little things, I tend to turn these off. They're on right now. We'll get into them a little bit later. These are your corner widgets. It allows you to, we have an assignment where we specifically mess around with it, but I'll show it to you really fast. It allows you to play around with your corners, whatever. Your corners of the objects here, like with a square, you can make a rounded corner versus a square corner, et cetera, et cetera. Again, later in the semester we get more into that. But you can turn those off. It's called a corner widget. So if you do view, and I have to look for it, hopefully not too far. Where is it? Anyway, whatever, it's here somewhere. You can do show or hide corner widget. Anything that's shown already will say hide, or anything that's hidden will say show, to show it like guides. If you wanted to pull, show my rulers. If you wanted to make guides, let's say, you wanted to have, this is a 1/4 inch, you wanted to have a guide at a 1/4 inch of your document. Basically, all you do is you go into your ruler and you just click and drag, and you'll see once you hit your artboard, this little dotted line shows up, and then you can drop it at a 1/4, and now we have that guide to use that we can snap to. So now we know that that's a 1/4 inch from the edge of your document. You can show guides, you can hide guides, or show guides, or lock them too, because right now by default they're not locked. So if you set up your guides and then you don't want to accidentally move them, you can lock your guides. So now there's no way you can select it. You can also make an object, which I do occasionally. You can also make an object a guide. So if you wanted to make, these 3 boxes a guide for whatever reason, let's say it's a publication for whatever reason, you want to make these a guide, you just simply go to guides and make guides, and now those are guides. And they're by default now, they're locked, so you don't accidentally, so if you wanted to fit that within your guides, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to undo a bunch. Somewhat lastly, yeah. Let me go back here. Aligning objects, going back to that. Again, you can use your smart guides, but let's say we want to align, you can use smart guides to align this object to this square, pink square, right? But if you had, let's say you had a bunch of different objects, if you wanted to do it at the same time, instead of grabbing one individually, and then this is going to be, there we go, that one individually, a relatively quicker way to do it, like let's say these are just kind of arbitrarily spaced. If you wanted to select, and I'm holding shift and selecting all 3 of those objects And then now you see your bounding box changed because it's showing us we're selecting the object, the edge of all the objects we're selecting. We get our align tools up here, but we want to align it to this pink box. So right now, if we align centers, it's going to move, it's going to average everything to whatever that average center between all three of those objects is, right? But we don't want to do that. We don't want that pink box to move, right? So what you can do is when you have all these objects selected, if you click one more time on the object you want to align to, and it has that highlight, and you can do it with any of the objects you've selected, but in this case we want to align to this pink square. Now that pink square stays put and the other one's aligned to the center or to the top or bottom, for example. All that fun stuff. That's one I use a lot because it's super, super helpful to be able to align to an object without having this object move instead of either dragging and dropping. Copying and pasting, there's a couple then specific to our next assignment, or our first assignment I should say. There's a couple other copying and pasting commands in Illustrator that I find super, super handy. I did one once already. So you have your arrangement, right, of your objects. This is how these are arranged. And you can go through, let's say you wanted this orange star behind the green circle. You can go to arrange and you can bring it back. You can send it backward one step. And it should be, hopefully, yeah. So it's under the green, but it's over the pink. Or if you want to send it all the way back, you can go send it to back. Honestly, what I tend to do a lot, just because I find it a lot easier, is I'll do a cut and paste in front or behind. This is a command that I use a ton in Illustrator. So I want this, let's say this is our sweet illustration we have. I will cut that orange star, and then I'll select the object that I want to either paste in front or behind. I want it to be behind that green circle. So I'm going to do a paste behind, which is edit, paste in back rather, not behind. Paste in back, or Command B for back. So I'll generally do the command a lot, but Command B. So now it's, it's behind that object. Or again, if you want it to be in front, you select that object and Command F for paste in front. Let's say we wanted both of these. Command B for back. So I'll do that a lot. There's also a paste in place when you have multiple artboards. Working with multiple artboards, I'm going to clear these guides because they're making me a little crazy. Somewhat lastly, working with artboards. If you want to create, your artboard tool is right here. So once you click on that artboard tool, it'll show you the bounds of the artboard. And then it also gives you can name it if you want. They just default to artboard 1, 2, 3, etc. It's a custom size. You can make it a whole bunch of default sizes with this drop down here. You can also create a new artboard, which will, just like any other creating new, yeah, I get that, thanks. Which will allow you to create a new artboard. It creates it the same exact size. And then you can change from there. So these are 4x4. Let's say we wanted to make this next one letter size. It's going to be massive. I'm going to undo that. Again, you can make them a variety of different sizes. You can also, I'm going to undo, if you copy just like you did, or just like I did with that object, if I use my option and copy and drag, and I'm holding shift so it stays aligned, it copies the artboard, but it also copies everything on the artboard. I use that a lot. Right now I'm just going to do a new artboard at the custom size of this here, and then I'm going to go back to my selection tool, and now our artboards are inactive. Going back to, this is a long way to go around, paste in place. which is super handy. So what paste in place allows you to do instead of front, oops. So here's where view fit all in window comes in handy. So now it fits all of our artboards in the window. Paste in place, what that does is if you copy this star, which I just did Command C or edit, copy, paste in place when you're on artboard 2 allows you to paste exactly in the position that this is on artboard 1, right? So if we're on artboard 2, I'm going to do a paste in place. And the only reason I knew I was on artboard 2 is just because I clicked on it first. So that comes in super handy if you're making something like for our next assignment. If you're making something with a logo and you have like a business card, letterhead, I forget what the other one is. They have like a book, whatever. And you want, you know, again, basically the assignment walks us through placing, you know, this object, we'll just say sort of arbitrarily, like give or take a 1/4 inch from the edge, from the top edge and the side. So if we do a copy and a paste in place, it automatically pastes that in the same exact location, so you know you don't have to, you know, you don't have to select this and then move it originally that, yeah, that was almost a 1/4 inch. So you don't have to move it here a 1/4 inch and a 1/4 inch, et cetera, et cetera. So you set up the one, and again, it'll do it, copy, and you go to your next artboard, edit, paste in place, or you can paste on all artboards as well. If you have like 10 artboards and you do paste on all artboards, it'll automatically paste everything on all artboards. Those are handy paste options that I use a lot. And we'll get into very quickly, I know I talked for the entire class again. I did not mean to. When we get into some of our rotate tools, our other part of the assignment is going to be creating a relatively simple illustration. We're going to be getting into modifying some of the shapes, moving and aligning, which I already showed you a little bit, transforming objects. So you can, under Object, Transform, Object Transform, you can move, rotate, reflect, scale, shear. So some of these are here. So we can do Object, this is why I do the shortcuts. Reflect, it keeps popping up on my second monitor. I will always check the preview button just to so it shows you what it's going to look like. So you can reflect horizontally or reflect vertically. So again, reflecting vertically is going to flip left to right, essentially. You can hit OK to reflect a single object, right? Or what we're going to be doing a bunch for the next assignment. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. Please don't crash. This is also why we need to save our work frequently. It's kind of like blinking for me is that Command S. Like, just get used to hitting save as you're working a lot because you'll lose work. I do all the time. So we'll do the transform, reflect. You can also hit copy, which is super, super handy, especially for the assignment that we're going to be doing. Excuse me. So when you hit copy, it reflects and copies that object. And then you can do a transform again or Command D, which will make another copy, another copy, and another copy, and another copy. With this shape, obviously, it's a little bit. Here, I'll show you that. This is going to be sort of more what the assignment is. Let's bring that about to the center. Change the color of my stroke to black. So let's reflect or rotate. What we're going to do here is I'm going to arrange, transform, rotate. So what I'm going to do with this, and it keeps popping up on my second monitor, I'm going to preview, and I'm going to rotate this 15%. And I'm going to tab through, and it's going to show us that preview of what it's going to look like. And instead of hitting OK, I'm going to hit copy. And now we get this second square copied at 15 degrees. And then Command D. Oops, I didn't mean to do it that many times. Command D, however many times I just did it, and it'll kind of give you this cool-ish kind of illustration. So using that transform again option for making transformations comes in super, super handy. And also for our next assignment,